I analyzed every frame of pro Valorant player Kaajak's gunfights and pitted him against a gold player named Path. After analyzing over 120 gunfights, the data shocked me. And I did this because I wanted to see if there was actually a measurable difference between a pro player and a gold player when it comes to crosshair placement. We're trying to measure crosshair placement here. You want your crosshair to be as close to the enemy head as possible, the distance between your crosshair and the enemy head when you first shoot. But the setup between holding and peeking is fundamentally different, and because of that, it needs to be measured differently. For holds then, we do the visual overlay, because in holds there is little to minimum player movement. The overlay then shows us how much the crosshair moved from when you first saw the enemy to when you shot. If it moved almost nothing, then the hold was perfect for the setup. Easy enough. For peaks, we needed to come up with a new measurement. This is the distance when we first see the enemy from the enemy head to the crosshair. The closer this is, the better set up the peak was, and the farther, the worse setup the peak was. When I figured this out, it clicked. But what this meant is that I had to separate my analysis between peaks and holds and measure the setup differently. If you don't know me, I'm Tim Young, and I've invested $100,000 of my own money to create an AI Valorant coach named Training Arts. If we see a measurable difference between these two, then we know this system works. And if this system works, then I can teach Training Arc to do something that took me weeks of eye-watering analysis and have it do it in just 30 seconds to improve your Valorant gameplay. All right, let's get into it. It makes sense to start with accuracy, right? I thought so too. I expected that Kaajak's accuracy would be better than Path's at every point, and that was not the case. It turns out when it comes to crosshair placement, Kaajak and Path are basically the same. Have a look. The mean accuracy at first shot for Kaajak is 21.51 pixels, and for Path, 22.24 pixels. That's basically down to measurement error between the two. The median is telling the same story here. Honestly, this finding made me pretty concerned. The one thing I thought would show a big difference between a pro and a gold player wasn't really telling us much of anything. I was beginning to worry. Was I getting this all wrong? If my approach to measuring crosshair placement wasn't showing a difference between a pro and a gold player, surely this approach is cooked. That's when I realized we can't just measure accuracy with crosshair placement alone. When I think of players with just scary mechanics, I think of TenZ, Aspas. If you're from CS, you think of Simple and Monacy. And not only are these guys crazy accurate, it's also that they're crazy reaction times and their flicks. And that's the piece that was missing here, reaction times. And so when I looked at the difference between Kaajak and Path's reaction times, it all clicked. Because while they're basically the same statistically, Kaajak is on average 50 milliseconds faster than Path. Effectively, Kaajak's reaction times nullify Peeker's advantage if he were playing a gold player. That's a huge difference. That's like comparing an F1 car to whatever this is. Kaajak and Path have the same accuracy, but Path takes 50 milliseconds longer to make that happen. The other way to think about this is, if we made Path shoot 50 milliseconds faster, how accurate would they be? Probably not nearly as accurate as they are, and this was the missing piece to the puzzle. What I found next about holds, though, was totally unexpected. Of Kaajak's 70 gunfights we analyzed, I found that he had 59 peaks and only 11 holds. Meanwhile, out of 53 gunfights, Path had 28 holds. As an aside, just in terms of gameplay strategy, that's pretty interesting. Not only did Kaajak take 17 more fights in the same number of games, he was way more active in peeking than holding angles. And what we found out about Kaajak's peaks is kind of insane too, but we'll get to that later. Focusing on hold then, what did we find? Let's start with hold setup. How accurate Path and Kaajak are on holds. This is kind of nuts. If you remember from the last section, they were both about the same accuracy-wise, but when we break things down into holds and peaks, we find that there's another layer to this story. Kaajak has a hold setup mean of 10.78 pixels. Again, remember, the smaller the better. Compared to 23.85 pixels for Path, he's almost twice as accurate. When it comes to holds, Kaajak is a monster. Think about how many more gunfights you would win if you barely had to move your crosshair at all. Kaajak's opponents basically don't stand a chance. And looking at reaction times, this is pretty insane. If you remember, on average across all events, Kaajak was 50 milliseconds faster reaction time wise. Well, when we narrow it down to holds, Path is about the same, still around 450 milliseconds, but now Kaajak is down to 333 milliseconds. That's a whopping 110 milliseconds faster, and his accuracy is twice as good. If he's reacting that much faster, you'd think he would be giving up some accuracy, but not our man Kaajak. When it comes to holds, he reacts faster and he's even more accurate. This next one is kind of nuts too. I know I keep saying that, but you have to remember I'm theory crafting how to measure this and then testing it. It was entirely possible that my theory was totally off base and that we wouldn't find anything interesting. Thankfully, that's not the case. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to measure peaks. Basically, if you have a good setup, you'll have an easy peak. If you have a bad setup, the peak's going to be a lot harder. That's the idea anyways. So let's see if this bears out in the data. We'll start with path. To explain some of this, we're going to have to talk a little bit about statistics. Sorry, not sorry. We have the peak setup on the x-axis and reaction time on the y-axis. On the flip side, the more difficult the setup, the larger the reaction time. And that largely bears out. Path has a larger reaction time. R squared means how much of the reaction time is explained by peak setup. And in this case, that's about 0.38. That means about 38% of path's reaction time is explained by peak setup. That makes a lot of sense, and we can see that in the trend line. The question then is, what do we find when we look at Kaajaks? We find that his reaction time is much tighter, but more importantly, that R squared number is now down to 10%. Unlike Path, whose reaction time is 38% explained by the peak setup difficulty. The worse the peak setup, again meaning the larger the reaction time. But for Kaajak, that's not really the case. Only 10% of his reaction time is explained by his peak setup. He basically reacts the same regardless of how hard the peak is. For Path, the human, the harder it is, the longer it's going to take. For Kaajak, the harder it is, he still reacts almost the same. Kajak's performance isn't really affected by the difficulty of the peak. I think that's like an absolutely astonishing finding. So what did we learn? Well, Kaajak clearly isn't human, that's for sure. But on top of that, crosshair placement comes down to setup and execution. And ultimately, we're trying to optimize two things: how close your crosshair is to the enemy's head when you shoot, and how long it takes to get there, reaction time. Those two elements are consistent across both holds and peaks. Setup though is unique, and it needs to get measured differently between holds and peaks. Here's what that means for the future of Training Arc. Doing this work, and it was a lot of work, means we're on the right track to being able to break down crosshair placement and gunfight technique in a way no one has before. We have new insights that validate our method and give me the confidence to build this out. And as we refine this and do more pro breakdowns, throw the pros you want me to do next in the comments, we're going to learn more and more. Even more than that, when we launch Training Arc with the crosshair placement module, we're going to be able to give you this level of analysis. Let me know if you want more deep analysis like this by giving a thumbs up or a comment. Subscribe for more Training Arc updates. And if you want to see how I figured out how to measure crosshair placement in the first place, then you got to watch this video next.